The most perilous thing you ever carried was your own open-handedness. It was the very thing that made your betrayal inevitable. Jung understood precisely why the person who pours out everything is always the one left holding the emptiness. What you called generosity was never simply that. Beneath it ran a contract, and the evidence lives in the part of you that has fallen silent. For years you emptied yourself completely, then watched them leave without looking back, until the version of you that once existed simply caved in. Before this is over, you will understand exactly why your generosity has kept purchasing your own undoing. You will recognize what the saving you keep attempting has truly been paying for, and the cost has always been yourself. You will follow the thread of this pattern backward through every betrayal until it leads you to the house where you first absorbed the belief that love must be won through what you could offer. You will come face to face with the agreement you entered before you possess the language to decline it, and the weighted release that lies buried beneath your sorrow. Because the most unsparing truth in all of Jung's work is this: the betrayal did not fracture a genuine connection. It uncovered an exchange you had been too afraid to examine. They did not seize what you had been guarding. They received what you had already been handing over to anyone willing to remain still long enough to take it. You extended charity of interpretation long past the point where any honest reading of events made it sensible. You took in the emotional atmosphere of every room, the moods that descended without notice, the silences that demanded careful translation. You filled their gaps so seamlessly that no one standing nearby ever noticed they existed. And you requested almost nothing back, because asking had long since come to feel like a vulnerability you had spent years conditioning yourself to abandon. You are hollowed out now, and still you perform the same examination of what went wrong, persuaded that the failure was one of measurement. If only you had been more enduring, more present, more prepared to dissolve entirely into what they required, perhaps the conclusion might have softened into something more forgiving. But as your gaze moves backward over the span of those years, something colder than grief begins pushing its way to the surface. This is not the opening act of this particular story. It is the third of these, or the fourth. The people are different each time. The circumstances shift and rearrange. The specific wound comes wrapped in a different form. Yet, beneath all of that surface variation, the conclusion is always the same. The single, unchanging element in each of those endings is you. That realization is precisely where most people turn away, because each possible explanation feels intolerable. Either existence itself has marked you for suffering, or you have been the quiet architect of your own collapse. Jung charted the interior structure of this exact cycle nearly a century ago, and he would refuse to allow you shelter in either of those narratives. He would tell you that whatever a person leaves unexamined does not wait quietly in the depths. It governs the entire structure. By the time you reach the end of this, you will understand the exact machinery behind why your open-handedness keeps ensuring your own abandonment. You will see what the saving you have kept repeating was actually acquiring, because it was always purchasing something, and what it bought was always you. But the peace Jung would ask you to remain with is more difficult than the betrayal on its own. The giving was never purely giving, and the evidence of that is the part of you that has grown quiet in the aftermath, the part that has stopped extending itself and finds itself oddly at peace with that. You are convinced that your open-handedness has always been pure. Each time you follow your motivations back to their root, you arrive at the same conclusion. I only ever wanted to be there for them, and you do mean it. The feeling behind those words is genuine. The urge rises before any conscious thought can catch up to it. But beneath that statement, moving without sound beneath everything, there has always been a ledger. You never composed it with intention. You would recoil from the idea that you did, yet every entry is recorded with remarkable exactness, and you produce it for collection at the precise instant the other person does not acknowledge all that you contributed. Jung identified a pattern that appeared to him repeatedly in people who had built their entire lives around the act of saving. The drive to rescue, to repair, to bear the weight of others is very often not an expression of abundance. It is a fortress constructed against the person's terror of their own powerlessness. When you are the one doing the healing, you never have to sit with how much healing you yourself still need. When you are the one keeping everyone else standing, you never have to notice that there are no arms beneath you. Jung gave a name to the shadow dimension of this impulse, the extended hand that quietly binds the one it reaches for. The assistance comes cloaked in genuine care, and concealed inside it travels a quiet need for control. Not control as authority over another, but control as the assurance that departure is impossible. This is where the persona enters the picture, and Jung was relentless in his examination of it. In Jung's own words, through the persona, a person attempts to present themselves in whatever form the world demands of them. But the danger is that the individual ceases to exist apart from that presentation. The entire mechanism of the trap lives inside that single observation. The mask begins as something practical. You step into the role of the steady one, the capable one, the person others instinctively turn toward when the ground beneath them gives way. The role is met with gratitude. Those around you exhale. They pass you their disorder because you have demonstrated that you will carry it without complaint. And gradually, with no single moment you can point to as the turning point, the costume grafts itself to you. You are no longer someone who occasionally offers assistance. You become the act of assisting itself. There is no longer a self waiting behind the function to return to. You have encountered the proof of this fusion in a way that is both specific and deeply disquieting. Imagine yourself placed into a space where, for once, no one requires anything of you. No emergency to contain, no emotional climate to regulate, no difficulty that has been assigned to you. By every logic available to you, what you ought to feel is ease. Instead, something quiet and anxious begins to move through you. You do not know where to place your focus or your body. It comes to you with the feeling of the floor tilting slightly, that you genuinely do not know how to occupy a space where there is nothing that needs your intervention. That unease is not evidence of something broken in you. It is the self-discovering that without the role, there is nothing beneath it to stand on. Remove the function, and where a person should be, there is only an unsettling absence. So the difficult truth is not that you extended too much of yourself, it is the reason behind the giving. You did not give because goodness alone moved you, though goodness is genuinely within your reach. You gave because being necessary to someone was the only version of security you ever learned to recognize. Somewhere in the earliest part of your story, you arrived at the understanding that someone who cannot be replaced will not be thrown away. So you purchased your place in every room you entered by becoming the one person no one could afford to lose. The care was genuine. It was also a recurring payment toward an insurance plan taken out against the terror of being left. And when that entire arrangement finally breaks, when the person you shaped yourself around walks away regardless, you are left with no choice but to face the question you have spent every year of your life stepping around. If you are not the person who repairs, who carries, who rescues, then what remains of you? But this, as Jung would press you to acknowledge, was never truly about the other person. She has moved perhaps a third of the way toward understanding this. She has turned her attention away from the most recent person who took from her, the former partner, the companion who received everything she offered and then simply withdrew. She has begun following the line backward, past that relationship and the one preceding it, past the shape of the pattern itself, until the line exits adulthood entirely and enters a specific house. And there she is, 7 years old, small, already in possession of a sensitivity most children are never required to cultivate. She can feel the energy at the threshold before the door swings open, can hear in the pressure of the approaching footsteps and the texture of the silence which parent has returned this evening. She has taught herself to reshape in anticipation, to become whatever is needed by the space before any demand is made. When her reading is accurate and she navigates the atmosphere successfully, the house settles, and for one evening she gets to feel something adjacent to being loved. When she misjudges, the warmth drains from the room, so she becomes extraordinarily precise in her reading. She internalizes the formula that will operate beneath every relationship she will ever have, entirely without her permission. Love is not freely extended. Love is something you produce through what you provide, through the watchfulness you sustain. Jung perceived this with complete precision, even if the language we now reach for to describe it had not yet been coined in his era. As Jung reflected, any analysis pursued with genuine depth will reveal this movement backward. The person, when pressed, retreats further and further toward the earliest bonds of childhood. And at the deepest stratum of all, what is found is the relationship with the parents. He named the internal imprint those formative years leave behind the parental imago. Not the parent as they actually were, but the version of the parent etched into the psyche. The foundational blueprint for how love must be pursued. And here is where the real cruelty reveals itself. The imprint does not develop alongside you. The woman following this thread backward is 45 years old, but the operating logic she is living from was composed by a child of 7, and it has never once been revised. This is why the same physical terror keeps surfacing in her body. She has lived the exact bodily experience of navigating her partner's unpredictable states, the constriction in her chest, the hyper-vigilant attention, the constant sense of ground that might give way beneath her. And then one day, she sees it for what it is. It is the same physical dread that moved through her when she crept across the kitchen floor at the age of 7. Her nervous system never registered these as two distinct events. To the body, they are a single occurrence, repeated across 38 years. There is no confusion in the body. It is executing precisely what it was conditioned to execute. Reading a volatile adult with perfect accuracy as the toll required for remaining safe. So the people who drained her in adulthood did not force their way through anything. There was no barrier to breach. They walked through an entrance that had been held open since childhood. And they did the instinctive thing. They moved through it. Because inside stood someone who had been taught to mistake being emptied for being cherished. What presented itself as her deepest quality, her seemingly inexhaustible capacity to feel for others, was at its root something else entirely. It was an extraordinary and expensive adaptation made by a child in an environment where being loved required the complete surrender of her own interior life. What you have carried as your greatest gift may be a wound that learned to dress itself in the language of strength. The one who took from you did not create this arrangement. They moved into a space that had been molded with devastating accuracy to receive exactly them. The relationship ends. Grief arrives first, and it is genuine, and it stays for a long time. But then beneath the grief, in a place you approach with hesitation, something else surfaces that you did not anticipate and do not feel permitted to call by its name. Release, not a faint tremor of it. Something deep, weighty, and total. The kind that moves through you when you lower something you have held for so long that you had stopped remembering you had a choice about carrying it. You have been freed from the relentless, unrewarded work of holding another person's whole world in place. And almost at once, those closest to you begin to say something. They tell you you are different now. Some say it gently. Others say it with a sharpness beneath the words. But what they are communicating is the same. You have become more rigid, more distant, something lesser than the person you were. You no longer offer elaborate justifications for your choices. You no longer move quickly to cushion every no you offer. You allow quiet to remain in a room, rather than rushing to populate it with comfort. To those who knew the previous version of you, the one who was always accessible, this appears as evidence of something broken. What they are witnessing is a homecoming. Jung would name what is now emerging from that long burial as the shadow. The dimension of yourself you were never allowed to inhabit. For most people, the shadow contains their anger, their desire for themselves, the drives that social life requires them to press underground. But for the person who has spent their life compelled to give, the contents of the shadow are the mirror image of this. And this is exactly the piece that no one tends to mention. If the entire architecture of your life was built on endless accommodation, on yes arriving before the question was complete, on a softness that never permitted itself to harden, then what was banished into the shadow is precisely what you could never afford to be. What lives in your shadow is not harshness. It holds your entitlement to refusal. It holds your legitimate desire for yourself, your ability to want something solely for your own sake, and feel no shame in that wanting. And it holds the accumulated anger, years of it, decades of it, pressed and stored. If you have encountered that release beneath the sorrow and found yourself ashamed of it, know that what you felt was never a form of cruelty. It was the first truthful message from a part of yourself that had been without a voice for the length of your adult life. There is something else unfolding beneath all of this simultaneously, and Jung identified it as the work that actually matters. In Jung's understanding, the highest aim of the inner life is conscious awareness, and the first movement toward it is bringing into visibility what one has been projecting outward. For years you place something onto the person who drained you. You cast onto them the image of unrealized depth, a soul misread by the world, an injured interior self that required only sufficient gentleness and time to unfold into its true nature. You devoted everything in you to saving that image. And the reason you fought for it so urgently in them is that attending to it within yourself had never been allowed. The injured inner child you kept reaching toward in them was the one living inside you. So observe what takes place at the precise instant the projection lifts. The collapse does not arrive with force or sound. It simply empties. Quiet and cold, the way a display goes dark. One morning you look at them and the image is gone. What remains is a grown person who made deliberate and repeated choices to take from you and would make those same choices tomorrow. This is the exact moment you become illegible to those who once knew exactly which levers to pull. The points of access remain visible, but they no longer reach anything within you. So the deterioration everyone around you keeps referencing is not a new harshness you have acquired. It is simply you at last in possession of your own edges, capable of retaining something for yourself rather than surrendering it the instant it takes shape. You did not diminish, you became complete, and completeness does not lend itself to being consumed. But the shadow you have reclaimed comes with a danger that is both serious and immediate. And this is the territory you were never expected to reach. She has settled into her newly drawn edges, and for the first time she can remember, they remain intact. She declines and nothing collapses. She withholds the rescue, and the guilt, which once roared through her, has become a barely audible frequency she can set aside. To anyone observing, this appears to be the resolution, and in part it truly is. But follow what happens to the energy now, that it is no longer flowing out of her, because that kind of force does not simply dissolve. It becomes a point of focus. She begins to detect calculation in every interaction. And what makes this complicated is that she is frequently accurate. The sensitivity she developed in childhood was never unreliable. She has now directed it outward at everything and amplified it beyond what the situation calls for. She categorizes people with speed and finality into two chambers, those who take and those who are taken from. She locates the calculation concealed in warmth, the request embedded inside the praise. Jung named this particular movement, and he regarded it as one of the authentic hazards of the awakening process. He called it enantiodromia, the law by which any position pushed far enough eventually flips into its own reversal. The person who gave without end does not arrive at wholeness by locating the midpoint. When pressed, they cross to the opposite extreme and become someone who extends trust to no one. And from within that position, it carries the sensation of clarity. It presents itself as finally seeing with precision, too discerning to be deceived again. But Jung's caution here is precise. As Jung understood it, the only one who steps free of this reversal is the person who has learned to maintain a real separation from what remains unconscious in them. The fist held tight presents itself as power. But it is not distance from what hurt you. It is the same wound still directing everything, simply operating from the other end of the dial. The earlier version of you was driven by the terror of being discarded, so you gave without limit. The current version is driven by the terror of being taken advantage of, so you offer nothing. In both cases, it is fear that remains at the wheel. You have not exited the mechanism, you have simply flipped its direction and named that reversal liberation. And beneath the solitude, there is a more subtle cost, the one that concerned Jung most deeply. He named it the inflation of the ego that believes it has arrived. When you determine that your perception alone is accurate, a chilled sense of elevation moves in and settles. Here is the mechanism stated without mercy. If you conclude that every person is after something, then the ones who damaged you are still the ones designing your life. They determined who you were when you had no limits. They are still determining who you are now that you have closed entirely. She is nearly through it now, and the evidence of that appears not in some significant event, but in a quiet, unremarkable one. She encounters someone new, and before long, because her attunement was never false, and she has ceased making excuses for it, she sees the shadow in them with clarity. She chooses neither of her old responses. She does not throw herself toward the wound to repair it. She does not retreat from it either. There is a third option she takes, and that third option is everything. She watches it. She identifies it internally with steadiness rather than disturbance. And then she remains where she is and allows that person to hold what belongs to them, staying present without reaching in to take it from them. She remains open and she remains distinct, both at once. Two qualities she spent her life being told were incompatible. This is the destination Jung directed us toward, and to describe it, he turned to the imagery of alchemy. You are not required to eliminate your sensitivity in order to stop being hurt. You are not being invited to become what wounded you. You have arrived at sight. You are asked to carry both abilities simultaneously within the same self without permitting one to consume the other. The attunement that perceives the pain and the boundary that will not dissolve into it. When you arrive at that third way of being, the whole terrain of your connections shifts, and it does not return to what it was. Those who used to drain you lose their hold, not through a barrier you construct, but because you withdraw the projected image they were living off of. Those who are real move nearer because care extended by someone who genuinely had the option not to offer it carries a weight that cannot be compared. Your agreement finally carries weight because your refusal has become a genuine and present possibility. An offering only holds meaning when the alternative was truly available. So the person who gives from a place of wholeness is neither a diminished edition of who you were, nor a softened version of what you nearly became. It is something that has never existed in you before. You retain the open-handedness entirely, the depth of it, the perceptiveness of it, the willingness to look at people without flinching. And you take back the threshold. You determine who is permitted entry, and in what measure, and under what conditions, and you cease redirecting toward others the saving that was always meant to begin within you. Jung did not chart this cycle to free you from responsibility, and he did not chart it to encase you in armor. Both are forms of avoidance, and Jung had no interest in avoidance. The person who has poured themselves out completely was not first abandoned by those who took from them. You were betrayed before any of that, by an agreement entered into before you possessed the capacity to decline it, inside a home where the lesson absorbed into your body was that being loved required making yourself indispensable enough to warrant being retained. That agreement no longer holds, not through forgiveness and not through retaliation, but because you have at last read every line of it in clear light. And what can be read in full can be declined. So if you have felt that substantial movement from the performance of the giver to the stillness of the sovereign, put words to it somewhere. Another person inside this same experience might encounter them. Write this below. I held the gift and reclaimed the gate, because the person who learns to carry both at once is the one that those who take can no longer decipher.